Today I'll expand on one of my chapters from Faith and Empire. My original title was actually From Iron Wheel Cakravartin to Cringeworthy Superfan, but my wife pointed out that maybe cringeworthy wouldn't translate so well. And I tried to add some text on my slides for non-native English speakers to follow. So Tibetan Buddhism's dynamic political role in the courts of Asia was a major catalyst in moving it beyond Tibet's borders to its neighbors. Tibetan Buddhism was especially attractive to conquest dynasties like the Mongol Empire, as it offered both a legitimizing model of universal sacral kingship, that is a religious mandate to rule, that transcended ethnic and clan divisions that could unite disparate people. And it also promised esoteric means to physical power, that is ritual magic, which could be harnessed to expand empires. By the 12th century, Tibetan masters became renowned across Northern Asia as bestowers of this anointed rule and occult power. Images were one of the primary means of political propagation, integral to magical tantric rites and embodiments of its power. Rulers such as Kublai Khan embraced this path and set a model of rulership that would endure into the 20th century. Even after the collapse of the Mongol Empire in around 1368, and the Chinese reclaimed their land, establishing the native Ming dynasty, the Chinese court continued to follow Mongol precedent for an imperial Buddhist vocabulary symbolic of divine rule. In the 13th and 14th centuries, most of Eurasia had come under Mongol rule, and during the early Ming, the Chinggisid world continued to span much of the continent, perhaps most famously represented by Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, founder of the Timurid Empire, which you see on the map over here. Thus, political legitimacy was not only a domestic issue, but concerned multiple audiences. By this time, Kublai Khan's model of rulership was recognized across Asia, and thus the early Ming rulers were speaking in the accepted language of power in declaring their authority. And here you can see on this map that the Mongols are actually still a major presence, right, all across the north here. And also, let's not forget that northern China had not been under Chinese rule since the fall of the northern Song in 1127, about 250 years. So this has not been the traditional understanding of the Ming, which is typically described as having expended a great deal of energy in reasserting an ethnic Chinese identity in the wake of Mongol rule. Maybe I will. There we go. Tibetan Buddhist art was created in the Ming imperial workshops, both for internal court use and as diplomatic gifts, a projection of what we might call today soft power. A continuation of the Tibetanized visual language of sacral rule can be found in this gold object here on the right, found among the gold work excavated from the Prince of Liang's tomb. So this is the Yongle Emperor's grandson, I believe. As you might recognize, this form of Mahakala was a centerpiece of Mongol imperial Buddhism and the most potent symbol of Tibetan esoteric power in the Yuan pantheon. And here on the left is a sculpture in the Musée Guimet dated 1292 with an inscription naming Kublai Khan and his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa as a comparison. While the Chinese goldsmith did not understand the form perfectly, he can still be recognized by the bar-shaped gong, or gandhi here, balanced across his arms. If this gold work is indeed a hat ornament, as identified in the excavation report, it is a remarkable political statement that a Ming imperial prince would prominently display an image of the most prominent symbol of Yuan power and sacral authority upon his head. This impressive painting of Mahakala, now in the Museum of Fine Arts in in Boston, is readily identified as a Chinese Ming work by the softening of the deity's wrathful aspect, most noticeably in his face. The cloth modestly draped over the naked corpse upon which he stands, which you see here, is also characteristic of other Ming Tibetan Buddhist works. The highly ornate decorative patterns in the background, and especially the painted floral border framing the canvas, which you see that runs all along the edge of the canvas, are specific details found on dated Ming works of the second half of the 15th century. Staple mineral pigments found in most Tibetan works, such as malachite and azurite, are absent in this work, and the deep blue-black of the deity was probably achieved through the use of the plant-based pigment indigo. Quite outside of these political circumstances, we should also remember that with the decline of Buddhism in India, Tibet became the new Holy Land in the West and source of Buddhist learning. In the Chinese painting, in this Chinese painting from a set related to the water land rite from Baoningsi, an arhat is depicted writing in Tibetan, which you see here, which had become by this time the medium of the faith. The arhats were considered the original disciples of the Buddha and the preservers of his teachings after his passing into nirvana. So now, with the passing of Buddhism from India, the Tibetans were perceived as the new preservers of those teachings. Also, for the Tibetans, as pilgrimage and trade became less viable to the West with India, the Chinese became increasingly important for trade, and one sees a noticeable shift in Tibetan populations to the east. And remember that more Tibetans now live in the eastern Tibetan areas of Kham and Amdo than the Tibet Autonomous Region itself. The first official expression of Ming interest in Tibetan Buddhism came only a few years after the Ming dynasty was founded, when, in 1375, the first Ming Emperor Taizu of the Hongwu period sent a letter of praise to the fourth Karmapa, Ronpo Dorje, who had held one of the highest positions at the former Yuan court. As previously mentioned, Tibetans provided a model of sacrosanct rulership and esoteric means to power for the Mongol Empire, and the Yuan imperial preceptor, the highest religious authority in the land, was always Tibetan. So here you see the model that's constantly evoked, right? Kublai Khan and his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa. The Hongwu emperor, formerly a monk under the previous Yuan system, would have been familiar with their role. He himself had been part of a movement to cast the overthrow of the Mongols in a Buddhist millenarian light, using such imagery as the coming of the King of Light, Mingwang, from which the very name of the dynasty was chosen. Sources also record that he patronized several Tibetan lamas and their monastic projects, which is contrary to the traditional Confucian account of the Hongwu emperor. Indeed, continuity can be traced in the Tibetan patriarchs who served both the late Yuan and early Ming courts. It was Hongwu's son, Ming Chengzu, commonly known by his reign title Yongle, who was the first Ming emperor to establish significant ties with Tibetan patriarchs, and there has been increasing acceptance that he was probably a believer in Tibetan Buddhism. The Yongle emperor was not the crown prince and had seized the throne, thus a cloud hung over his legitimacy. As part of his strategy to bolster his right to rule, he invited high lamas to come to court. As an imperial prince, he was granted the former Mongol capital in Beijing. He took up residence in the former Mongol palace, opened the former imperial libraries and treasuries which had been preserved and sealed, and retained some of the Yuan palace eunuchs who were left there. This was likely one of the direct conduits of Mongol imperial culture, which would have included Tibetan Buddhist practices into the future Yongle court. The Yongle emperor is known in Tibetan sources, such as the Blue Annals, as Yewang, or the Prince of Yen, his previous title as the Prince of the Beijing area, suggesting that the Yongle emperor, who was not the crown prince, was well acquainted with Tibetans and they with him during his early career in Beijing, before he seized power. The most significant event in Sino-Tibetan relations during the early Ming was the visit of the fifth Karmapa Deshin Shekpa to the early Ming capital of Nanjing in 1407. In dealing with the Karmapa, the Yongle emperor consciously drew on parallels in his own actions to Kublai Khan's relationship with his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa during the founding of the previous Yuan dynasty. According to Tibetan sources, the Yongle emperor expressed an interest in recreating their priest-patron relationship. The Yongle emperor also made a similar offer to send troops into Tibet in order to install the Karmapa as temporal ruler and forcibly convert all monasteries to his order, an offer which the Karmapa similarly declined. This offer can be seen as something of a trope, as it parallels Kublai's offer to Pagpa, as was Pagpa's declining in favor of religious plurality. No mention of this is made in Chinese sources, as the Karmapa turning down the emperor's wish to project Ming power into Tibet was not the kind of thing to be recorded in official dynastic histories, as it did not reflect well on the emperor. The Yongle Emperor also bestowed on the Karmapa the title Dabao Fawang, or Great Precious King of the Dharma, the same title Kublai bestowed on Pagba when the former declared himself Great Khan. And you actually can notice here the Yongle Emperor's official portrait reproduced exactly in this Tibetan painting, right down to his little wavy mustache. It's only that he's been reversed to fit the new composition. The Karmapas were of particular interest to the Yongle Emperor, as they were the last preceptors of the Yuan and were viewed as anointers of sacral kingship par excellence. Indeed, after the Karmapa's visit, the Yongle Emperor styled himself a Cakravartin ruler. And here in this detail, we see this relationship codified, where the Yongle Emperor is receiving consecration as a sacral ruler, and you can see his face is reflected in a mirror during ablutions here, just as one would consecrate an image. Some Tibetan sources also obligingly describe the Yongle Emperor as a Cakravartin king after these events, specifically an iron wheel Bala Cakravartin, one who turns the wheel of the doctrine by force. One of the most famous visual manifestations of the Yongle Emperor's engagement with Tibetan Buddhism is a monumental 50-foot long hand scroll called the long hand scroll for the salvation of Ming Taizu, which records the miraculous occurrence during the memorial services performed by the 5th Karmapa in 1407 at Linglu Si, Nanjing's largest temple for Emperor Taizu, Empress Ma, as well as Taizu's parents in a series of 49 narrative paintings. On one level, this painting can be viewed as containing a political agenda, as rumors circulated of Yongle's possible Mongol or Korean ancestry after he seized the throne from his nephew, with assistance from Mongol cavalry in 1402. Questioning Chengzu's ethnicity, denying his very Chinese identity, has been a means by which to isolate and marginalize the Yongle Emperor's interest in Tibetan Buddhism, one still employed to this day. For example, Wenfang, a professor of Chinese art at Princeton University, in his highly influential publication Possessing the Past, introduced the question of Tibetan influence in the early Ming by referring to the rumored Mongol or Korean ancestry of the Yongle Emperor as fact. The manner in which the Yongle Emperor came to power naturally put a cloud over his reign and made him concerned about the image of his own legitimacy. This hand scroll had a clear political agenda in confirming his right to rule, and used strategies similar to those employed by the Mongol court to project power across Asia, such as multilingual inscriptions in Chinese, Persian, Tay, Tibetan, and Mongolian. This recalls Mongolian strategies such as the multilingual inscriptions in Tibetan Mongolian square script, more commonly known as Pagpa script, which you see here, Chinese, Tangut, and Uyghur lining the walls of Juyongguan Stupa Gate just north of Beijing, which also spoke to imperial identity in a Buddhist framework. As Pat Berger has discussed, the hand scroll also makes clear use of the well-established Chinese Confucian tradition of omens, employed as legitimizing propaganda and recorded to demonstrate the ruler possessed the mandate of heaven. Here we see a comparison, auspicious cranes, or cranes over Kaifeng, recording an event at the Northern Song Imperial Palace in 1112 during Song Huizong's reign. We see this relationship was also important from the Tibetan side as well. Later portraits of the 5th Karmapa directly reference this Yongle hand scroll and features the distinctive architecture of Linggu Si, which you can recognize by this covered gallery which connects the hall to the pagoda, represented here, and of course, the portrait of the Yongle Emperor. Such images as the Yongle hand scroll, made in Ming workshops and sent to Tibet, had a profound effect on the development of Tibetan art. Indeed, this hand scroll is the only surviving named model that religious masters of the Karmakagyu order instructed the artist Namkatashi to take as a model for the creation of a new visual idiom for the Karmapa's court, the Karmagadri, in the late 16th century. Beyond such well-publicized objects as the Yongle hand scroll, which had a clear political agenda in confirming legitimacy on the Yongle reign, by contrast is the 1413 missive scroll, which the Yongle Emperor sent to the 5th Karmapa describing the famous eunuch Admiral Zheng He's voyage to Sri Lanka and the capturing of the Buddhist tooth relic. In it, the emperor describes his own visions during his religious practice, something which went clearly beyond the bounds of what diplomacy would require. Visual evidence for continuity from the Mongol Yuan in the artistic production of the Ming imperial atelier is the presence of an already fully mature Sino-Tibetan artistic synthesis in the early years of the 15th century, the most famous example being the bronzes of the Yongle period. Here we see a fusion of Nepalese sensuousness of form with the Chinese aesthetic, and a jeweler's-like precision in their ornamentation. Such richness of detail and visual complexity in the ornamentation lies at the very heart of the imperial splendor conveyed by these objects. The sheer volume of such Tibetan Buddhist art produced at the Yongle court can perhaps only be matched by the Manchu Qianlong emperors in the 18th century. As Heather Stoddard has demonstrated, the Yuan court prototypes for these Yongle Buddhist images can be found in Yuan woodblock prints locally in the surviving stone carved images at the Zhuyongguan Gate, which date to the final years of the Mongol Empire. Images made in the Ming workshops and sent to Tibet also had a profound on Tibetan art, especially genres such as arhat painting and lineage depictions, as well as copies of famous images such as the one known to Tibetans as the Sandalwood Lord of China, the Gyananaki Tsenden Jowo, which were copied and venerated. So for instance, here on the left is an example in the Chernushky Museum in Paris, and here in the center, a painting with a Yongle rain date in a Tibetan monastery in Tsang, and on the right, a much later copy. Here we see Ming Arhat composition on the left, and a Tibetan painter closely following in this composition in the center, and a clear adaptation of this these visual conventions in a Tibetan lineage figure depiction here on the right. So if you look here at the way that the tree bend, which frames the arhat, and the cave, the attendant, the lion, all closely follow the Ming Chinese model. But perhaps the most significant commission by the Yongle Emperor for the Tibetan cultural world was the massive 1410 printing of the Tibetan canon in Tibetan and Chinese in Hangzhou. While there had been earlier printings of individual texts, this was the first time the Tibetan canon was printed in its entirety, increasing its ability to be reproduced and disseminated. These printings were bestowed on temples and monasteries throughout the Tibetan Buddhist world. One was gifted to the head of the Sakya order in 1414, and another to the Lama Shakyeshe in 1416. Shakyeshe's biography describes it, and I quote, as a wonderful set of the Tripitaka printed for the first time in China, printed in vermilion ink, and its covers faces written in gold letters. Such volumes were bound in luxurious red lacquer book covers like the ones you see here, made of white sandalwood and ornamented with incised decorations in the 8 auspicious symbols inlaid with gold. The prominent recipient of the 1410 printing, Shakyeshe, was a personal attendant to Tsongkhapa, founder of Sera Monastery, and the third of 3 main Tibetan patriarchs received by the Yongle Emperor. He received the title Dadzi Phawang, or Great Compassionate King of the Dharma, from the emperor. Originally, it was the famous Tsongkhapa, foundational teacher of the Gelug order, who was invited by the Yongle Emperor. But finally, after repeated requests, Tsongkhapa sent his disciple Shakyeshe to the Ming court in his stead. And needless to say, this snub of an imperial invitation is also not recorded in Chinese sources. The use of silk in the creation of Tibetan Buddhist icons was a prominent characteristic of Mongol Yuan court production, a practice continued by the Ming. This remarkably intricate silk embroidery was given to Shakyeshe in about 1419, and he's actually depicted up here in the top right. Here I've pulled out a detail. This remarkably intricate silk embroidery of the meditational deity Havajra received as both a diplomatic gift and documentation of imperial legitimacy. As first discussed by Amy Heller, according to an extensive Tibetan dedicatory inscription on the back, it was gifted to Shakyeshe in recognition of his visit to the emperor. Building on Amy's initial work, I focus my reading today of this object on 2 lines pulled out here and translated at the bottom, which I quote, "Homage to one who came to the presence of the Dharmaraja," meaning the emperor. "Homage to he who gave me, king of merit," right? This empowerment, what's depicted on the front of the image. The choice of subject matter for this gift is quite telling, as Hevajra was an essential initiation given to the Mongol emperors as part of their sacral investiture. The Yongle emperor followed these yuan precedents in his own initiation as a sacral ruler, receiving Hevajra initiation from each of the 3 main Tibetan hierarchs who visited the court. He thus received both blessings and also a kind of consensus about his legitimacy from the 3 major leaders of the time. The theme of this gift is therefore as much about authenticating the Yongle emperor's initiation into this tradition and legitimacy as a sacral ruler as it is about the Tibetan Lama who received it. And taken together, one could also speak of such underlying messages of Dharmaraja activity related to the gift of the awe-inspiring 1410 Tripitaka as well. The imperial kins of Jingdezhen continue to produce Tibetan-inspired objects in porcelain, another Chinese luxury medium, as they had done under Mongol rule. However, rather than a focus on figural forms as manufactured under the Mongols, like the one you see here on the left, the Ming created more utilitarian vessels like the one you see on the right. Extremely simple, elegant forms, such as this ewer shaped like a monk's cap, were also based on yuan prototypes. And this ewer features a subtle incised decoration and an invocation in Tibetan under the transparent glaze, which you might be able to barely make out along the belly here. While discussions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism tends to be limited to the Yongle emperor, he was by no means the most extreme among Ming rulers in his adoration of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan art continued to receive significant court patronage, especially under the Shwenda and Changhua emperors. And here are 2 examples from the Changhua court. He was known to be quite an enthusiast. But it was Emperor Wuzong of the Zhengde period who was an enthusiastic patron of Tibetan Buddhism who took his zeal to a level few had dared. According to his unofficial biography, the Wuzong Waiji, and I quote, "The emperor studied Tibetan scripture, converted to this religion, dressed in Tibetan monks' robes, and practiced Dharma at court. This no doubt horrified the Confucians at court, who had to compete with the monks for the emperor's ear. Much of this is omitted from his official accounts of his reign, which simply say that he was an ineffectual ruler, and I quote, not interested in culture, and therefore little was accomplished in the arts." According to Tibetan sources, the Zhengde emperor adopted the Tibetan name Rinchen Pelden, and even went so far as to style himself as an emanation of the 7th Karmapa. Far from wishful thinking on the part of Tibetans, this assertion and the mission of the eunuch envoy who carried these tidings, along with the many gifts, was received rather coldly by the Tibetans, by the Karmapa's court. Sort of get the sense that the Tibetans thought he was a bit of a nutter. This letter of invitation in Chinese and Tibetan was preserved at Serpu Monastery and photographed by Richardson, which you see here, photos of which are now part of the Pitt Rivers Museum archive. Chinese sources only mention that the mission was a failure, but not the Karmapa's refusal to even receive them. A detailed Tibetan first-hand account of this ill-fated mission is also recorded in the Kebe Gaton, which further relates that the Chinese were so insulted by the cold reception that they took all their toys and went home, only to be sacked by bandits on their return trip. As Sperling has discussed, Golo Tsawa's account even includes an incredulous Tibetan Ripley's Believe It or Not account of what a eunuch is. The very concept of eunuch must have been quite alien to a culture where a sizable percentage of the male population were celibate without resorting to surgery. And here's a lovely expressive portrait sculpture of our first-hand witness on the right. Richardson thus identified the Tibetan name, Rinchen Pelden, on such tanka as this, as none other than the Tibetan emperor himself. And Marcia Haufler has further contextualized this painting by identifying the occasion of this commission as the emperor's birthday. Other extant Tibetan paintings, such as the Changhua paintings I just showed you, other rituals, temple constructions, and so on also date to the several emperors' birthdays, suggesting that Tibetan Buddhism was an important part of the emperor's personal sphere. And as David Robinson has observed, these close ties between the imperial family and Tibetan Buddhism were well known by the populace in the capital, as lamas were granted special privileges such as carriages and escorts, which would have been visible to all. A more polished professional painting, now in the Musée Guimet, from a similar context, which subtly integrates Tibetan imagery into a Chinese visual mode, is this martial figure charging on his quite charming dapple gray steed. The swirling pastel-colored auspicious clouds of pale pink, yellow, and orange that frame the composition are a common trope in Ming Buddhist painting, as observable in the Yongle hand scroll and many Ming wall paintings. As Marcia Haufler has demonstrated, it is quite likely that this painting of Kubera was once part of a stately and imposing set of 9 paintings, flanking a very similar work in size, style, and subject matter of Vaishravana, who you see here on the right, with an identical inscription to the previous Zhengde painting, dating it a few years later to 1516, now in the Nelson Atkins Museum, also painted on the occasion of the Zhengde Emperor's birthday. And the difference in appearance here between the 2 paintings here has as much to do with later restoration work. The martial theme of the guardian Vaishravana and his 8 horsemen generals, known for intervening in battle since the Tang dynasty, joined the Zhengde Emperor's adoration of Tibetan Buddhism with another one of the emperor's assumed identities, the general Zhu, seemingly inspired by the iron-wheeled warrior ruler, the Yongle Emperor. Indeed, in the following year, 1517, the emperor went north of Juyong Pass in the guise of this general to see action against the Mongols raiding on the frontier, which Ming forces seemed powerless to repel. So I guess you could say he was pretty into cosplay. The martial depiction of the armored god, his retinue of stately celestial officials, and gleeful demonic warriors, like this fellow giving you the side eye, you know he knows he's being naughty, are all drawn from Chinese divine martial imagery. However, the deity that floats above at top center here is clearly drawn from Tibetan models. The sword held by the warrior's right hand, the mongoose vomiting jewels held in his left hand here, are all clearly drawn from Tibetan models. And his dark color all identify him as Kubera, one of the 8 masters of horse and guardian general of the southeast in the retinue of Vaishravana, a wealth god, war god, guardian king, popular in both Tibetan and Chinese pantheons. Taken together, the Zhengde Emperor's interest and actions suggest a wish to revive the imperial model of the martial universal ruler following his predecessor, the Yongle Emperor. Here, a suggestion of imperial identity is revealed in the banner standard held over behind Kubera. Here I pulled out a detail, bearing the 5-toed dragon, reserved only for the emperor. You can see his toes. So, as we can see, demand for Tibetan objects within the Ming court was strong, and the impetus for their creation multivariate. Moving beyond the emperors, interest in Tibetan Buddhism also extended beyond the court. As Marcia Haufler has observed, not only are Tibetan images representative of a system of belief embraced by the Ming rulers, they also represented a category of material culture fashionable among the upper-class devotees of Buddhism throughout the Ming period. A compelling example of private Chinese patronage of Tibetan images in the Ming is the commissioning of the marvelous images named Sutra and Dharani of the Buddhism Bodhisattvas, which you see here, printed in 1431 in Beijing, now in Musée Guimet's library. And to my knowledge, this was first introduced in modern scholarship in Heather Stoddard's early Sino-Tibetan art in the early 70s. This is a woodblock collection of popular texts and illustrations as conveyed by the 5th Karmapa during his visit. Although there are colophons in Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Mongolian, the primary language of the text is Chinese, suggesting that the patron was Chinese. It is interesting to note regarding Chinese interest in Tibetan images that in the colophon, the patron specifically expressed the desire that the illustrations be in a Tibetan style. Aside from the emperors themselves, eunuchs were also important conduits between the creation of art at court and court sponsors of Tibetan Buddhism. This was due to intersecting layers of the eunuch bureaucracy at the Ming court, both in their roles as the controllers of the imperial construction apparatus, the Ministry of Works, and as the official imperial envoys to the Tibetan patriarchs. Thus, the eunuchs were in close contact with Tibetan clerics at court and often became their personal patrons, and used their positions overseeing court artisans to create Tibetan Buddhist images. This sculpture, for instance, is a reliquary from Hongjue Temple in Nanjing, donated by the eunuch Li Tong. This same eunuch of the inner court, Li Tong, was also the principal patron of a small private temple on the outskirts of Beijing, founded in 1443, Fahaisi. Li Tong served as director of all imperial artists, the director of imperial accoutrements. While the basic architectural and painting programs of Fahaisi are clearly Chinese, a subtle Tibetan presence is observable in various Tibetan forms that appear throughout the temple. For instance, on the ceiling in each of the 3 coffered bays over the central altar are 3 large mandala, which are linked to Tibetan mortuary liturgy, such as the central Vairochana, which is specifically related to the purification of all bad rebirth tantra, the Sarvadurgati Parishodhana Tantra. In this way, the Tibetan mandalas on the ceiling are linked functionally to the Chinese waterland ritual paintings on the walls in their role for the salvation of the dead. So eunuchs didn't have, of course, children to perform memorial rites. So they would have these special temples called shangsi built to do it for them. And if you have a chance to visit Beijing, I strongly encourage that you visit. The wall paintings are quite stunning. For instance, here's a detail of Marichi in that assembly with the Tibetan 5-leaf crown. And the squatting form of Mahakala, our old friend, here on the far right, was once found amongst the temple statuary, which was sadly destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. Direct evidence of a significant Tibetan presence at Fahaisi is found in 10 Tibetan names on the back of the record of Fahaisi stele. The first and most famous on this list we have already met, Tsongkhapa student Shaki Yeshe. However, there is one problem with his presence on Fahaisi's donor stele, as he died in 1435 en route to Tibet, while construction of Fahaisi did not begin until 4 years later in 1439. Oh, and here's a famous silk in the Met collection, which also bears his image. The third name on Fahaisi's stele, Pelden-tashi, is the most interesting in this context, for he not only appears to have played a role in the founding of Fahaisi, but was also abbot of Chutansi in Amdo, modern-day Qinghai, far away on the Sino-Tibetan border, a provincially located temple built with imperial sponsorship. Pelden-tashi was directly involved with the Buddhist practice in Beijing and wielded significant influence within the National Buddhist Registry, the Sengwusi. He served as the 5th Karmapa's translator at court in Nanjing, translated numerous Tibetan texts into Chinese, and ordained several Ming officials, including some of those sent to expand Chutansi. Chutansi, in Tibetan, Drotsang Dorjechang, was founded in 1392 in present-day Ludu County, 43 kilometers east of Xining in modern Qinghai province, here marked here by the red star. Its location is described in one of its own early Ming dedicatory stele as being on the border connecting with the Western kingdoms, that is Tibet, and thus at the meeting of the northwestern Ming frontier and the eastern border of the Tibetan province of Amdo. As Sperling has discussed, Chutansi is one of the earliest expressions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism, and an examination of Ming chronicles and Chinese imperial records reveal that Chutansi was dependent on the Ming court support and protection. In turn, its patronage was part of a larger Ming Sino-Tibetan border strategy to establish an alliance between the local authorities and the imperial court. And as Gray Tuttle has observed, if one maps where Ming military garrisons end, one finds that a network of such court-supported temples picks up. The early Ming court repeatedly sent eunuchs to inspect and participate in the construction of Chutanzi, making it an important court construction project on the Chinese Empire's periphery. Chutanzi, like Fahaise, is Chinese in architecture with a mixed Chinese and Tibetan painting and statuary program. The outer painted galleries depicting the life of the Buddha in blue-green Chinese landscape, such as you see here on the left, while inside the halls, the paintings appear Tibetan in both style and iconography, such as you see here on the right. However Tibetan they may appear at first glance, Chinese painters' hands are revealed in many small details, such as the skull crown of Mahakala here on the left, where their skull crown is strung together through the eye sockets, which is painted in the very same manner as Mingwang found in Chinese temples, such as Pilusi, here seen on the right. And shorts placed modestly on the figures, otherwise depicted nude in a Tibetan context, which is also characteristic of Chinese production of Tibetan Buddhist imagery. And perhaps this is more clearly seen here in the painting in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston on the right. This suggests that Chinese painters of the imperial court atelier were able to adjust the style and iconography of their paintings between Tibetan within the halls, like on the right, and Chinese in the outer gallery, such as that on the left. A brief account of the casting of the central hall's main image, the gilt bronze Buddha, which does not appear to have survived, sadly, is given in the imperial bestowal of Chutanzi's golden Buddha image stele dated 1418. In this inscription, the Yongle Emperor projects himself as a universal sacral king, ruling over his kingdom. The Yongle Emperor evokes the image of King Indrabhuti of Udayana, the Indian historical model of devout rule. Enhancing the aura of piety in the emperor's act is a story familiar to the making of sacral images across traditions, designed to increase the efficacy of the image, and I quote, though the artisans worked for a long time, they could not complete it, until one day when they went out for food, leaving the workshop deserted, the divine body manifested itself. This frightened and amazed everyone and was seen as a magical manifestation of the powers of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, thus completing the work in a single casting. Thus, that image was known as a miraculously self-arisen image, Rangjung, a special class of sacred image within the Tibetan tradition. Chutanzi was once well appointed with such gilt bronzes produced at the Ming court, as evidenced by a surviving near life-size bodhisattva with a Yongle rain mark, which you see here on the left, one of the 8 great bodhisattvas which once flanked a central triad, now in the Qinghai Provincial Museum. So this is almost life-size, 4.5 feet tall. So one can imagine that the central image would have been, maybe even a story tall. These are recorded as created in imperial workshops and sent west, suggesting a larger pattern of other statuary. This one on here on the right is now in the Chernihiv Museum in Paris, who we had the pleasure of hosting during the Faith and Empire exhibition in 2019. Both of these sculptures are linked by size and a distinctive trilingual rain mark inscriptions in Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan, which is between their feet in the front. The halls of Chutanzi become increasingly splendorous in their imperial architecture as one moves towards the rear of the complex. The rear hall, Longguodian, is said to be based on the blueprint of Fengtian Hall in Beijing's Forbidden City. The description in the local Tibetan history, the Dome Chozhong, implies that the rear hall was built as the Yongle Emperor's memorial hall, a statement reiterated in the imperial bilingual dedicatory stele. The rear hall contains a long life to the emperor inscription on a wooden placard, which records that it was erected in the second year of Shende, 1427, by eunuchs of the Directorate of Imperial Accoutrements, right? So this is the same organization as Fahaise in Beijing. This Director of Imperial Accoutrements, Meng Ji, was sent by the Ming court to personally supervise the construction of the rear hall. Such a high-ranking officer of the imperial construction apparatus was almost certainly accompanied by numerous high-ranking master craftsmen from the imperial atelier. It would seem from various textual evidence that the main halls, as well as the covered gallery and the 8 subsidiary halls, were all conceived of as part of the same construction project by the Yongle Emperor, and it stated directly that Shende Emperor was fulfilling the wishes of his father and thus completing his vision. Textual evidence suggests that Chutansi was only one example of a larger pattern of Ming imperial patronage along the Ming Tibetan frontier. So here's another example, one of about 25 or 30 such Ming imperially sponsored temples in the area. An imperial formulation of Sino-Tibetan art and architecture is thus suggested by temples such as Fahaise and Chutansi, both early Ming temples of Chinese construction decorated with various quantities of Tibetan imagery. While one might be tempted to dismiss the Tibetan elements that appear in otherwise Chinese architectural contexts found at Chutansi as simply resulting from their close proximity to the Sino-Tibetan border, in other words, as markers of their regionalism or provincialism, the presence of the metropolitan temple Fahaise, as well as other works discussed here today, suggests that a more complex and imperially sponsored formulation of Sino-Tibetan art and architecture was operative. However, Tibetan Buddhism was not consistently supported during the Ming. When the Tibetan-crazed Zhengde Emperor died without an heir in 1521, and a cousin, raised far from the capital, ascended the throne, it marked an important shift in both the identity of the imperial family and the orientation of the Ming court away from Kublai's model of rule. Under the succeeding Taoist Jiajing Emperor, Buddhism was suppressed, temples were destroyed or converted, and Tibetan Buddhists were actually ejected from imperial institutions. However, a second massive conversion of the Mongols to Tibetan Buddhism in the late 16th century replaced waning Ming interests later revived by the Wanli Emperor. Thank you.